Yeah.
You
Who
are-
needs
you are the
sunshine?
backbone of the Leeds Tech community. Well done. As you will notice, we're two organisers down this evening. We've got bugs or childcare
Stuff.
or both.
Okay, children. One follows the other.
So I'd like to say thank you to our sponsors, Platform, Fruition IT. I think Fruition got an offer on at the moment with a free hug with every job. I got 3 hugs down the pub on last meet-up, so
That might just be a special offer for you. I've never received that offer.
I'm not sure how Rob feels about it.
I think Rob is right up for a hug. He looks like he's up for one.
Get out.
Yeah. Okay, so thank you for sponsors. I guess we'll start with a little bit of .NET news.
yeah, news.
There is some news.
Whose production site got taken down this week?
Yeah. Why did production site get taken down?
Cloudflare killed it.
So
there was a root leak in America where someone with a Linux server with very low capacity said, all my routes are really good, so half the internet got diverted into this very small underperforming box, including all the traffic for our site. So for about 2 hours, very little was getting through. There's a Cloudflare did a blog post on it.
It took our issue trucker down over.
It was a bit pain in the arse.
Nobody got raised issues.
What was telling was my managers assumed it was my code that was bad.
No,
Cloudflare status says they're responsible.
It's their fault.
It's their fault.
Still your code. Have you read their blog posts?
Yes.
They were pretty furious about it.
Yeah, it's Verizon's fault for just accepting routes that are obviously daft.
Yep.
So that is obviously news. .NET Core 3 preview 6 is out, and then 7 will be out in a week.
Much pointer.
Xamarin.Forms version 4 is apparently out. I used to do some Xamarin.Forms stuff. I checked my repository. I'm currently on version 1.5, so I've got to do some updating. And I'd be quite excited to know later what is in version 4, if that's part of the talk.
It's not, but I can tell you.
You just tell me later, it's fine.
Yeah, I can mention.
Any more .NET news that people are aware
Would
of?
anyone like the audience like to contribute to .NET news? Maybe something about serverless databases?
Oh, yeah. It's not really that new. It's not that new, but there is SQL Serverless. So if you're looking for a very cheap database solution, then SQL Serverless is a great way to do it because you're not paying when you're not using it. So you're only paying for the data storage. So I took a £2,000 a month database and got it down to 33p a month.
Wow.
I will show you.
Is that including the storage for it?
Sorry?
Is that including the 33p including
The
the storage?
33p is basically the storage because I call it so infrequently. Now I call my mobile app speaks straight to a web API that then calls after their SQL Serverless. The first thing my mobile app does when it launches is fetch that list, which then tickles the serverless SQL instance, which can take a while to boot, which can then force the app to crash because it's taking too long to boot. So there are some workloads where it wouldn't work, but I'll show you maybe a little bit on that if we have some time. But yeah, so that's not new, but it is new.
Things back to mine.
So
Any other news? No? Okay.
it's a quiet, sunny month. So we've got a little bit called Kaizen Bits, where Kieran normally tells us about the latest NuGet package that he's most excited about. Kieran's not here. Like this. And then there's been a few sort of times when I found myself writing my own extension methods for it. For things like, I wanted to use distinct, but I wanted to use distinct for a particular property on the object. So I wanted to say, get me all of the something that has a distinct value for this. And that's not really how distinct normally works. But so I wrote my own version of distinct by, which lets you do that. And then I found that there's a package that already has that, and I didn't need to write it myself. And there's lots of other nice stuff in there. So I thought I'd just very quickly show you some of the things that I found most useful in it and that I've previously written my own versions of. So, distinct by, I've written all my examples using collections of aliens because I thought that would make sense. So, we start off by getting loads of aliens. and then you've got all the different combinations of how any other alien will interact with any other alien when they meet. But you can find more sensible reasons for needing that thing. So that is Cartesian, and then min by and max by. So if you've got a big sequence of integers and you want to know the minimum one, just calling .min makes a lot of sense. But what if you've got a load of aliens with different ages and you want to find the youngest alien, and you want to find the oldest alien? So there are the two, there's min by and max by, which do just that. But min by and max by both return a collection, because if you've got a big sequence of numbers and you want to find the smallest number, then there is just one number. The smallest number is 7. But if you're trying to find the youngest alien, and there are 2 aliens that are both 7, then you actually want to have that collection returned to you. So that's what min by and max by does. And so I'm doing aliens.max by alien.age in Earth years, and that will get me the collection of either one alien, if there's only one oldest alien, or if there are 2 or 3 aliens all the same age. That will return a collection of them. And then there are loads more. Those are like the sort of the 4 functions that I found that I've actually used before and written myself. But there's loads more in this library. I'll just see if I can find the link. Where did I put it? How do you follow links? Hello? Ooh, Microsoft Edge Dev. Definitely that one. What could possibly go wrong? So this is the website anyway. So if you just Google more link, you'll definitely find it. I found it because I was on Stack Overflow, and when looking for an implementation of one of these things, John Skeet gave a lovely implementation, then just went, or you could go and use more link instead. And there's the GitHub page for the actual thing, but then the most useful page I found is the examples page, which is a separate GitHub repository, but just has a really nice list of all the different things that it does, and of which there are very, very many. And some of them are stuff I can't imagine myself ever using, but some of them actually plug nice little holes in link that I've, particularly distinct one. There's loads of times I've tried to use distinct and realised that actually it only works for objects that we can compare directly and not for sub-properties on them. So, yep.
Does it offer anything for left joins?
There is a left join.
Right, good.
I'm sure. See, I only got as far as F. E, F, G, full join, group index, insert, left join. And there's probably even a right join and a middle join and an upward join. all the joins. So I genuinely found that useful, and I think that it's just a nice little small thing, and it just plugs a few little holes, so hopefully somebody else might find that useful too. And that's me done.
Oh,
Thank you very much. Unless we have any breaking .NET news. No.
Might James do it? Application Microsoft.
Or we need to plug you in. Can we plug it in?
Show of hands for those of you who have used Xamarin before. So a few of you. Who's heard of Xamarin? Okay, so you've all heard of it. Perfect. This isn't an intro to Xamarin talk, so you can rest assured you're not going to get a 101 on that. Who's using Azure? Any competitors to Azure? Okay, cool. Is it Google? 2 of you? AWS? Yeah, okay. Interesting that I said a competitor and someone kept their hand down and I said AWS and the hand went up. So today I'm going to be showing you how you can build a no-code backend for a Xamarin.Forms mobile app using some Azure services. It's pretty new, these services, they're in preview. So let's just jump straight into it. Who is this guy? My name is Mike James. I'm a senior cloud advocate at Microsoft. I joined Xamarin in 2013 or 2012, I can't really remember. If it was 2012, it was Christmas, so it doesn't really matter. It was basically 2013. And I was like the second UK or European employee. The first one moved to the US after, so I was alone in Europe for the longest of times before we grew the team. So I've been a mobile developer.
Sorry, were you less beardy then?
I was less bearded.
I think I did meet you.
Yeah, it changes things. I don't have a very strong jawline, so this hides it quite well. So it's never coming off. So yeah, I look quite different now. I probably also, I've had braces as an adult, so maybe you saw me when I was really ghastly. Perhaps.
I'm sure you look lovely.
You're very kind. So, sorry for that digression.
My fault, sorry.
So I've been a mobile developer for most of my professional career, but before I joined Xamarin, I was working building mobile apps for an architectural lighting control company. We built controllers that control lights and things like the London Eye. So that was all C++. And when I joined Xamarin, I kind of focused very much on iOS, and then Microsoft acquired us and I started learning the cloud, but with a focus for how do I build back-end solutions to power my front ends. I tended to focus on something called Azure Mobile Apps. Anyone used Azure Mobile Apps? Not a single one of you, that's perfect. It's our .NET framework-based SDK. You can put it into a web API project, and then there's a mobile SDK that ships with Objective-C, Java, and .NET, so you can run on Xamarin. That is .NET framework only. So if you go into Azure today in the portal and you type in mobile, it'll probably be one of the top hits, Azure Mobile Apps. Don't select it, just as an FYI. It's not got a pathway to .NET Core, so you would be building a new project that would be legacy as soon as you deploy it. So let's talk about App Center. Who here has used App Center? Not a single one of you. You've half used it.
Toyed with it.
You've toyed with it. Well, hopefully by the end of this talk you'll be like, this is amazing. I'm going to use it for everything. Hopefully. Look more positive. Potentially. Good.
See how it goes.
So it was released in 2017, so it's still fairly new, and it's the replacement to a few products within Microsoft. So have any of you heard of Hockey App? A couple of you. So this is a replacement to Hockey App, but also when they acquired Xamarin, we had some extra technologies around, so like Xamarin Insights, which was basically competing with Hockey App. So our crash and analytics reporting didn't do distribution, but there's enough overlap that when Microsoft looked at our suite of products and services as part of the acquisition, they kind of went down the list and scribbled out some and gave big ticks next to others. Xamarin Test Cloud, which is our testing data center in Denmark with physical devices, that got a tick. Xamarin Insights got a cross. So that was killed, but obviously we still had all the engineers and we had Hockey App. So we kind of merged them into two, and we built this product from the ground up, so there's no code from those original services in this, but that it's built from those teams. And it's designed really as a one-stop shop for mobile developers to build and track their applications once that they've shipped them. Everything you can do within App Center is available to you through a REST API. So although when I show it to you, it will be through this rather good-looking portal, you don't have to use this portal. If you want to use a REST API or automate anything of these steps, you can do that. And in fact, right at the end of the session, I'll show you how I've automated some of these processes. Historically, it's been DevOps focused. So it's been about the build and testing and distribution. And then once you've done that, once you've distributed the app, it's about tracking how is your app being used and any errors and crashes that occur. So right now in production, we call them beacons. We have build, test, distribute, diagnose or diagnostics, analytics, and then push. And then in preview, which was released at build, we have two new features, which are authentication and data. Now, given that no one in the room has used App Center before, when I say these are new, you can think of them as new. These actually existed all the way back in 2017 using that Azure Mobile Apps that I said not to use. So we released it with these, and then we decided very quickly that that was a poor strategy given we weren't sure of what the future was for that service within Azure. So we removed those beacons, and it's taken us a couple of years to get these features back in. But I think that the way we've done it this time is significantly better. And I hope you'll agree by the end of the session. So we'll run through those beacons quite quickly, a brief overview of how it works with those existing features in production before we move on to preview. Just an FYI, if you have any questions, please just interrupt me or throw something at me. I don't mind. I may lose my train of thought, but I'm sure someone can remind me how to get back on the track. So building. We write our applications, we check them into some kind of source repository, I hope. No one using Dropbox. Good. And we need to build our applications. Now, a lot of the time, if you're just a one-man band, you might be building on your local machine, you create your application, then you throw it over to Apple, and you start the distribution process. Or maybe you're using Google, and it's straight into the App Store, Google Play Store. But it's built on your local machine. Well, that's not a great way if you're working with a big team, because you kind of end up in a situation where it works on Dave's machine, but it doesn't work on your machine, and it's a nightmare for anyone to join the team and just get everything set up and to guarantee that the builds are going to work for them. So we have the continuous integration as a beacon within Visual Studio App Center. What it allows us to do is connect to our code repositories, and then anytime we kick off a commit, so we check in some code, we can automatically spin up a VM for you in the background and start the build process. So this isn't just for Xamarin or .NET applications, this is also if you're building your apps with Objective-C, Swift, Java. It doesn't matter if it's building for mobile, we can build it within Visual Studio App Center. In fact, we also support some desktop. So if you're building UWP, anyone building? 2 of you. Cool. You can also build in Visual Studio App Center. I've got a Mac application that I built using Swift. I built that in Visual Studio App Center. So it's not just mobile, but it tends to be quite mobile focused, and it's not just .NET. We can bring any language. And it has some pretty interesting build configurations. So it's not super simple, but it's not as difficult as something like Azure DevOps or setting up Jenkins or anything like that. It kind of holds your hand through the process and has some sensible defaults around what you might want to have as your build configuration. Once you've built your application, you need to test it. And we have a UI testing solution that I alluded to moments ago. It's a warehouse in Denmark, in Aarhus, with over 3,500 physical devices, so actual phones and iPads, as they come from the manufacturer, unjailbroken, unrooted, and they're factory reset after every user, or any of you, have used these devices. So what we do is we upload our application with some UI test scripts written. Has anyone written a unit test before? Some hands aren't going up. I asked, when I gave this talk before, I was asking who's writing unit tests, and basically no one put their hands up, and I ended up shouting, "Shame on you," at the audience, which wasn't a good feeling. But we should all be writing unit tests. We should at least aspire to be writing unit tests, even if it's tomorrow's job. We can do the same for the UI. So we can create little units of tests to check that our user interface is working as we expect it to. And then we can test these on physical devices. Now, for iOS, this isn't such a big problem. It's really easy to guarantee that if my app works on this iPhone, it should pretty much work the same on anybody else's iPhone in the room. Who here is Android? Yeah. Android is a beautiful disaster of an operating system. I really like how Android looks, but it just has some really strange quirks that make it quite difficult to develop for. So the difficulty is the fragmentation between the different manufacturers. They're all forking Android and doing their own little tweaks. They're all applying their own UI themes to it. And it makes guaranteeing that your app is going to work across these myriad of different devices extremely difficult. Back when I was an evangelist at Xamarin, it was like 2014 when we first potentially met. There were 17,000 different varieties of Android. That's 2014. I've got no idea what that number is now, but no one here in this room is going to have 17,000 devices to test on. Who's testing on more than 100 devices? 50 devices? More than 20? 10? It's getting embarrassing. 5?
Probably
5? Okay, we've got 1. 2? Who's testing? Anyone testing? Okay, so I guess we're testing on one phone. We put it on our phone, it works here, let's ship it to the store. It's a really poor approach. So with Xamarin Test Cloud, we have these devices ready for you to upload your APK to or your app. We'll run the UI test script. We take screenshots of every step of the way, which we show you in the portal. We take logs so we can know exactly what the device was doing as it was running these tests, and we will send you an email automatically if there's been a failure of any of these tests. So we actually had a customer in the UK, Tesco's, so a fairly significant customer, that used Xamarin Test Cloud for all of their apps, because they use Xamarin to build their mobile applications. And they had tested their mobile app on Android on a particular tablet. And when we were showing the marketing team and the engineering team the value of this, the engineers were like, we test on these devices, we don't need this solution. And we brought up the portal and we showed their app running across all of these different Android devices. And one of the girls from the marketing team was like, sorry, can you just click on that one, please? I was like, I clicked on it, bring it up. And the cherries have been squashed because the aspect ratio had changed on just this particular flavour of Android. Then just kind of looking aggressively at the engineers, why are the cherries squashed? And go, I don't know, we do test on that device. I promise, we have that in the drawer. And it's like, well, what version of Android is it running? And it turns out it was just a 0.1 version difference between the version that they were testing on in the device at the bottom of their drawer versus what we were testing on in Xamarin Test Cloud. Now with Xamarin Test Cloud, we don't just have one of an iPhone 10, for an example. We have multiples of the iPhone 10 in order to get your app test to run in parallel, but also to make sure that we've got coverage across all the different versions of the OS supported on the device. So as each new point release of Android is released that supports a particular flavour of the device, we'll go out and we'll buy another one. We'll make sure that it's running that version. We'll put it on in the data center so it's available for you to start testing with. Now, what's really nice about this is that we can, with the build configuration, just click one box and we can say when we've built, we want to automatically test our application. Now, that's what I've done here, and I haven't paid a single penny for this or configured anything other than just ticking a checkbox. And it will launch my application and just check that it doesn't crash on startup. So if it doesn't crash on startup, then it can move on to that distribution phase. But I get the results here, I get the screenshot, and I can see the logs of what the application was doing. Obviously, if it failed and it crashed on startup, then it wouldn't hit distribution, then my users would never see the application. So I don't get to pick with this free checkbox, with just test on any device, what device it's running on. It will just pick a random device that isn't currently being used in the data center, and it will get your app running on that. So if you're using that build configuration or the build option within App Center, it's kind of a no-brainer to tick it because it doesn't cost you any money, and it makes sure that, especially on Android, it's going to pick one of our thousands of devices to test on, and it could be a wild card that you've never tested on before, and your app may crash on launch. Alternatively, you can sign up with your credit card and pick as many devices as you want. As I say, we've got a whole host of devices, over 3,500. The key thing is that it's very secure. We factory reset these devices after every single customer has used them. So there's no data sitting around on these devices. They're in a known state as they come from the manufacturer. So if the application is crashing,
I'm guessing you've got multiple of these devices with different versions, right?
precisely that. So we've got multiples of everything you see here, supporting every single flavor of the OS that will run on it. And you can change the location, you can change the language. You can change an awful lot of settings. What you can't do is get access to things like SIM cards. So we remove the SIMs of all the phones, and obviously they're sat on a Wi-Fi network for communication. Now Android's a really interesting one because we have customers like Snapchat that use this service. And Snapchat is obviously testing a camera. Well, how do you test a camera for devices that are in a warehouse? And these devices are actually physically locked in safes, and if they're not in the safes, they're locked in a room that has got two wind up like the shop gates to stop thieves getting in. There's one on the inside, one on the outside, and then the door in the middle to stop people getting in. And we turn the lights off obviously when there's no one in there. So if you're testing your very camera heavy application in a dark room, not ideal, right? Well, with Android what we can do is we can swap out activities. So we can say, when you're asking for camera information, we can pump in and feed in known data. And then if your app's responding correctly, you're going to get a pass. Or we can pump in data that we know should make your app crash or should fail a UI test. And then, obviously, if it doesn't, we'll flag that as a failure and you'll get an email to let you know. So you can test some advanced hardware, but you can test hardware functionality of these devices in our data center.
So the one I've used is Browser Stack, where you can define a suite of devices to run it against. How does this sort of shape up against that?
So Browser Stack, is that just testing the size of the window and that your application is resizing correctly?
I thought they used actual devices.
They at least use real files instead of the emulated.
Interesting, yeah. So the thing about emulation, and it's the cheapest way to do it. I mean, we could spin up lots of simulators for iOS or Android emulators. But if we take the simulator as an example of why do I need to test on a physical device? On Mac, the iOS...
It's nowhere close.
Well, it's nowhere close because, number one, it's a simulation, but on the Mac it has access to all of your computer's resources. So I've written some horrifically inefficient code that works beautifully on this i7 with 16 gigs of RAM, and I can use my mobile app in the simulator, and I'm like, I'm a genius, this works perfectly, ship it to the App Store. And then I want to show my girlfriend, so I sideload it onto my phone, which obviously got a lot less resources than 16 gigs than an i7, and I go and show her, and you scroll through the list and you kind of get 3 frames a second. So you always need to be testing on the physical devices. So the cheap competitors, or the cheaper competitors I should say, tend to go with the emulation route. I'll be frank, when Microsoft acquired Xamarin, I thought that this would have been one of the sides of the business that they put an X across. Because what we're doing effectively is every time there's a new phone, we're going out and we're buying a lorry load of depreciating assets and putting them in a data center, which will then they'll get used less and less and less as the devices become older and older and older. And we're obviously not going to ever resell them because we're such a big company. And it's a very difficult business to scale. Microsoft kind of operates, if you're not reaching 1 million customers, then is it really a business that we want to be in? You can imagine trying to have a million concurrent developers all testing their applications. You need an awful lot of devices. So there's only really the big players that can compete in this, which is why you'll see, our biggest competitors also have offerings. But it's not something that tends to be pushed because it's so difficult to grow and scale from a financial perspective. But anyway, so we.
Surely it takes a while to do a factory reset.
It does, but that's why we have parallels, so that you're not waiting around too long. And it's a fire and forget, to be clear. You'll start to get the results rolling in, but you don't have to wait around for all of the results. We normally see results start to roll in for most customers after about 8 minutes. At the worst case, you should get a response within 8 minutes of it being tested on at least one device. But it obviously depends what devices you're trying to test on, the popularity. When iOS 13 drops, there's going to be a lot of demand for people testing against iOS 13 within our data center. So you need to be aware of that when you're picking your devices and choosing when to test.
So Xamarin obviously supports as well as Android and
Yeah.
iOS as your EP, which you mentioned previously. Are there any Windows devices? No, but there's obviously no phones.
Obviously no phones.
But are there any Windows devices to be able to test them together with if you? Yeah.
There are not. There is talk. There was talk. I don't know if that is continuing. There was talk about adding a series of new types of devices.
I thought Windows would have been one of the. It's almost needed more than those because you have to compile to .NET Native for release, and that's really fucking
So yeah, the thing we were. The reason originally, and I don't know if this situation has changed, but originally the reason why we didn't support Windows was purely because the accessibility APIs didn't exist in Windows that we hooked into. So the way this works is it's all accessibility APIs. When we do a rotation, the first ever version of Xamarin Test Cloud back in the day, we had physical devices on sheets of metal with actuators. and when you say I need to test the rotation, the device would go and you would test the rotation. That doesn't scale. So we discovered that there's APIs that we can call to say, okay, I want to swipe to this particular location, I want to do a software rotation, please. Windows didn't, I don't know if it does, but it didn't have those APIs available to us, which is why we didn't add support for that. But there's been talk over the years about adding lots of different services. At one point I heard Miguel de Icaza talking about the potential, and this probably will never happen, but Miguel was very keen to add PlayStation 4 as an example. Mind blown. But there, I believe the conversation is still ongoing with Windows, but hopefully you understand the reason why. Is there another question regarding that? So distribution, we've tested our app, it works perfectly because we wrote it and we're geniuses, right? We need to distribute that to our users. Now we could just email out the APK or the .app, but there's probably a better way to distribute our application, and that's using Visual Studio App Center Distribute. And this supports iOS, Android, and Windows, and Mac OS. And it allows us to group together our testers. So we can say I want to test to or release to alpha testers or beta users, and I can create my distribution lists. I can have it so that when I send out the email to a new user that I want to test my application, that when they're signing up within the browser, it allows them to install a certificate, and that certificate will then allow me to get access to their UUID, so their unique code, which then allows me to make sure that my provisioning profile works on their device. So quite a nice little way to make sure that my profiles are going to work on the devices that I'm releasing to. We can release directly to the app stores, or we can release to Intune. So if you're using enterprise technology to lock down your employee devices, we can release straight into the enterprise stores as well. And we can do in-app updates, which is actually just a notification that pops up into the application to tell you that there's a new version available. And when you're doing that, when you're doing that, you can have the option to say that I want to just notify that there's an update, or I want to force an update. Now, if you notify the update, they can click cancel and they can ignore that there's a new update. Or if you force the update, every single time they launch the application, they're going to get that nag screen, and it's going to sit there, and it's never going to go away until they update the app. You had a question, sir?
So, do you know when you release an app to like the Google Play Store, did they, I forgot what time limit it was, it's like 2 or 3 weeks that they've got to do their testing or whatever. Does this kind of bypass that, or?
No. So we don't bypass any of the processes, and Google Play Store is pretty easy to get on. You just upload your APK, and it's basically straight into the store. Apple have historically taken a little bit longer because they have a human review the application and check that it, number one, is a complete application, number two, that it's not using private APIs, and number three, that it's not going to steal your credit card details or cause any issues or goes against the rules of the App Store. Used to take about 2 to 3 weeks, especially in the lead up to the new release of iOS. They've got that down to normally a couple of days. There's a website you can go onto which will actually tell you how long the review period currently is if you were to go into the submission right now. All this does is automate that submission process. So with Apple, it would automate the delivery of your application to them to test. If they're happy with that, then it will obviously go straight into the App Store. With Google, it can go straight through because they don't have that rigorous review process, which is why Google Play is slightly more dynamic in terms of a store than Apple.
Does it help you with the Apple certificates, or are you still on your own with that?
You're still on your own with that, and that's part of the build process. So we specify our certificates when we're building. The only thing we'll do in terms of the certificates to help you is to get those UUIDs. It will put them into a CSV file so that you can upload that to the Apple developer portal.
My memory of Apple certificates is that it takes me about 2 days, and then afterwards I go, this is easy, next time it'll take me like an hour. And then I don't do it for such a long period of time that I'm right back to it taking me 2 days again.
Yeah, I hear you on that. That's definitely the situation a couple of years ago. Apple have massively improved the difficulty of getting your system set up. So what happens now is on the Mac, you'd actually just load Xcode. You'd go Apple or Xcode, preferences, account, and then you would sign in with your Apple developer ID. And there's a button that you can just hit to tell it to basically provision your machine and get all the certificates and provisioning profiles available. So it's just a one click and boom, your machine is ready to go.
Just a quick question on the distribution. So I'm in the process of doing it at the moment now. So when I have my VSTS CI/CD pipeline all set up, and then would this be an extension on top of that? On top of that, once my build, I've got my artifact. Now, is that a manual process that I'm doing to go into Xcode, or does this link that straight to Xcode if there's all the tests? Because if you go into like Apple Connect or something.
So the first question about VSTS, if you're already using VSTS, then you probably won't want to use the build step within App Center. You can still plug into the testing and distribution if you want to, but there's quite a lot of overlap between Azure DevOps or VSTS, whatever we're calling it this week, to Visual Studio App Center. It's kind of pick what's right for you. If you've already got those pipelines built, stick with that.
So would you, if you were, because at the moment we've got our pipelines to build our service layer, we've got our web layer now, we've got sorry to go on, but we've got our mobile layer now that we're creating. Should I go straight into using App Center rather than stick with the other VSTS? I'm going to have to build a new pipeline for my app anyway. Would it be better to go straight through on it?
It depends, is the short answer.
Okay.
The long answer I can give you in the pub later if you're going for a drink.
Yeah, okay, cool.
Perfect. So we've built our app, we've shipped it.
Sorry, just on distribution. How does it handle enterprise distribution? If at all?
It does handle enterprise distribution. It only supports Intune at the moment. So it can hook in with your Intune account and then you can just deploy into your Intune store.
Okay.
So you've shipped your wonderful app, you've tested it, it works, your users are happy with it. How do you actually find out what's going on with your application? Hopefully it's bug-free, but it isn't always. So we have crash and analytics reporting built in. So on the crash side of things, it's going to catch any uncaught exceptions for you. It's not going to consume these, it will rethrow them, but it will catch them and it will report them into the dashboard that you see here. And we get the exact line number, so my app crashed on line 106, and it will tell me the class that it crashed in, and I get the full stack trace reported, so that I, as a developer, can work out very, very quickly what's caused this application to crash. It will also tell me, is it unique to a particular flavour of the OS, so is it a version of the OS that's causing the problem, is it a particular hardware that's causing the problem, is it a geographic location, and it will try and be intelligent in the groupings within the list of crashes, so that you're not going to see, for example, that top crash here is my Azure Map service. I'm doing a HTTP request and I haven't got it in the try catch. So if I'm not connected to the internet, it fails, it throws an exception, I catch that, it's reported here. It's showing a count of 1. If that was a count of 600, I wouldn't have 600 of these items. I would obviously just have the one row item and then a count of 600. It's going to filter that list intelligently to show you the most pressing issues at the top, or what it believes to be the most pressing issues at the top for you to start to debug. So if you've got a crash that's affecting one user, but it happens to have crashed 600 times, probably not the priority versus the crash that's happened once, but for 600 users. So our application crashes. We've got that in the portal. How do we track what our users are actually doing with our applications? Well, we have analytics. So this is just a one-line add-in. Again, it supports all of the platforms. So it's not just Xamarin developers that can use this. If you're using Swift, Objective-C, Java, React Native, whatever technologies you're using, App Center has something for you. It supports custom events. So I can say to it that I want to track particular things. Now in the case of my application, I'm just tracking which views people have navigated into, so nothing too extreme. But I can set up to export this straight into Azure. So I use Application Insights. Has anyone used App Insights? Cool. So I can stream all of this data, those crashes as well, straight into Application Insights so that I don't end up with 2 different portals to have to go and navigate into in order to get an overview of what my application is doing. I can just go straight into App Insights and boom, it's all there. Now, we can also view the log data in real time so we can see what our users are doing as they're doing it. And by default, this is GDPR compliant in that we're not collecting data that can identify an individual user. You can, and that's really important, with these custom events, you can track anything because you can just pass in a dictionary. So you could track which user has caused a crash, for example. You could add their user ID to a crash report. I wouldn't recommend it because it's going to make scrubbing that user data out of this service extraordinarily difficult. And we do actually have a full-time team of engineers that work on App Center to help customers that have got themselves into a bit of a pickle with putting data in places that they shouldn't. But if you follow the standards in our documentation, then you shouldn't get into a GDPR issue. But you can do with these custom events if you start to manually add customer data to that. Push notifications. So really important with mobile applications is user engagement. And one of the best ways to engage with your users is a timely push notification. 75%, it sounds like a made up statistic, but I promise you I read it on the internet, so it must be true. 75% of app uninstalls come as a direct result of a poorly timed push notification. Because it often reminds a user that they've got that app installed on their phone that they don't use anymore. They go, oh yeah, I don't like that app, and it's just annoyed me when I was on the train or whatever, and I'm just going to delete this right now rather than have to deal with that again. So being able to send push notifications at the right time is quite important, and making sure you're sending them to the right people. So we have this built into Visual Studio App Center. So again, it's just one line of code to integrate on the client side. So in Xamarin.Forms, all I've done is initialize Visual Studio App Center push as a service, pass in my client ID, my unique key, and then it's available to me on iOS. It's a very similar process with Android, although there's some Firebase goodness that you have to play around with as well to get that to work. But it allows me to send push notifications to groups of users, so I can group them based on things like their language, what operating system are they using, what country are they currently in. Basically any of the data that we're collecting in that analytics tab, we can then use to segment our users to make sure that we're sending notifications to the right people. And we can also push silently. So I was chatting to my colleague Dean about this because I'm actually using push notifications, but I need to add the push silently feature because I'm updating my database and I want that data to be available within the application straight away. So I need to do a silent push notification down to all the registered devices to tell them that there's some new data in my database, please. And there's no visual within the application to say there's a notification, but the OS will actually wake my application up and allow it to execute my refresh code for a couple of seconds, around 30 seconds before it will kill the app again. That allows for me to programmatically tell all of my apps to go out and update their data from my database, which is quite a nice way to make sure that when the users next launch the application, that it's full of fresh, exciting data. If you're retail and you've got a sale, it's great to make sure that when people wake up and turn their iPads on, they've got all of the new items that they can buy on the cheap. So the previews, the thing that I'm very excited about. These were released at Build, so not too long ago, maybe 2 months ago, and it was literally only a few days ago, 2 or 3 days ago, that we had the first update to the SDKs that we released. So there's a little bit of newness around authentication, which is exciting me, but the two new features are authentication and data storage. So we'll start with authentication. So it's built on top of Active Directory B2C. Don't we all love Active Directory? Is everyone familiar with B2C? So B2C is business to consumer. Active Directory Normal is kind of our B2B, or boring to boring, as I like to call it. And you have the B2C, which is our consumer-facing product. So it's our cloud-based authentication solution. It's obviously designed for global scale. So this can support millions of concurrent users at once. We have extremely intelligent AI that can check for discrepancies in user sign-ins, for example. I can specify a rule that says that I need to be aware of geography in sign-ins to make sure that an individual user hasn't travelled faster than the speed of light to sign in. So for example, if I were to sign in here and then ask someone in China to go and sign in with my credentials as well, it would flag that and then lock my account automatically. I can connect into a myriad of different providers in terms of authentication. So I think I've actually got a slide that covers that. In terms of the configuration, we're still using the Azure portal. So it's not quite as nice as the rest of App Center, where it's all built into the nice App Center portal. With Authentication and Data, because they're preview, we get taken off to the full Azure portal. But what this means is that we get all of the power of the standard B2C. We're not getting some kind of gimped out version of it that some engineers decided which features we can and can't use. We have access to everything if we need to. But obviously the tutorial that shows you how to get this set up kind of gives you the absolute bare minimum. As I say, it's powered on Active Directory B2C. It wraps the MSAL library, which is the Microsoft Authentication library, which is our long-running replacement to ADAL, which is the Active Directory Authentication library. Anyone used ADAL? Anyone enjoyed using ADAL? Hands have gone down. MSAL's better, or it's meant to be better. Turns out that building authentication libraries is really difficult, and there's a lot of edge cases, which is why ADAL became quite difficult to improve, because of making sure that all of those edge cases still work. And in building the replacement, they still need to support those same edge cases. So it's proved an interesting challenge for the team. But the SDK is built on MSAL, and it reduces the amount of work as a developer to add authentication down to just one line of code. Now the first 50,000 authentications are free. You can also do multi-factor authentication. So you can have a push notification come down that says that they need to scan their face or put their fingerprint in, or type in a passcode, depending on how you're doing your multi-factor. These are charged at 3 cents, so American cents, not Euro cents, per authentication. That's only if you're using multi-factor authentication. If you're just going with standard authentication, then you get 50,000 for free. In terms of that line of code to get authenticated, as I say, it's super, super simple. All we're calling is await, so we're not animals, we're using async. We've got auth, sign in, async. And what we get back from that is a user info or user information object. When we call that, this is what we see on the screen. I can customize this in any way that I want. So I can customize all of the CSS and the HTML to make this look precisely how I want it to look and match my brand. I don't have a brand for this application, so I've left it at the default. But what I quite like is the ability to just pick these identity providers. So by default, I've gone with email and password, so you can sign up with a custom email address and password, which Microsoft will store. That's not going into your database, that's going into the Microsoft database. But then I've also selected Microsoft and GitHub as 2 identity providers. And that was super simple to get configured. You just go into the portal, you say I want GitHub, for example, and it say what's your client ID and what's your API key. And when you provide those in the redirect URL, I think you have to set in GitHub, and then you're pretty much golden. It's just going to work. So to show you what we actually get with this user information, hopefully you can see that. We get 3 properties back. Last week we only got 1 property back. So this is why I say this is new and exciting to me. Last week all we got was the account ID, which was pretty useless to me as a developer, because I wanted access to some of the claims as part of the sign up, so that extra information I asked the user. And without the token, I couldn't get access to that. But now we actually give you the access token as well as an ID token, so you can then query using MSAL, so that Microsoft Authentication Library. You can query Active Directory B2C yourself and get all of the information that you require out of the authentication system. So in terms of those identity providers, this is the slide I wanted earlier. We've got Amazon, Facebook, Microsoft, GitHub, Google, LinkedIn, and Twitter. We're also going to be supporting Apple Sign-In. So I have a blog post which covers this, if anyone's interested in how to add that in, how to support Apple Sign-In with Active Directory B2C as of today. But we are going to make sure that that is a supported identity provider, where it's just as easy as checking that box and copying over a few details, which is quite nice. Are we all familiar with the Apple Sign-In? A few heads, some people kind of looking at me vaguely. Apple at their WWDC conference, which was 3 weeks ago. I was looking at my tan, I was on holiday, seeing how much it's faded. I think it was about 3 weeks ago, 3 or 4 weeks ago. they're big on their privacy, are Apple, and good on them for that. And they've been looking at the behaviour of some of the larger identity providers, and every time we sign in, they're tracking us. And Apple isn't particularly keen on this. So what Apple is saying is that if your mobile application today authenticates using both Google and Facebook, if you support both of those to sign in, you have to, if you want to build for iOS, support Apple sign in. They recommend that you place the Apple sign in button above the other two, but it's not a requirement. In fact, in their user interface, human user interface guide, they actually show you just a sign in with Apple button, and then below that a label, which is tappable, which is then to other sign-in providers, which I think is their preferred style. But with that approach, as a developer, you're getting basically no information from the user. You're just going to get a token to know that Apple says that that's a real human being that's tied back to a credit card. The user has the option to say that if you ask for an email address, for example, the user has the option to say, I want a relay address instead of giving out my real address. And Apple will look after that relay for the life of that user using your application, which is quite nice from a user's perspective. But if your business is about collecting data, then I can understand that it might be a little bit uncomfortable. So if you want to get around that, you may want to look at dropping at least one of those two in order to avoid being rejected from the App Store. But that's worth knowing that come September, normally around September when Apple release a new OS, that iOS 13 will require, if you support Facebook and Google, you have to support Apple sign-in. But we can help you with Visual Studio App Center. So that's authentication, just one line of code, super simple. Data storage, this is the actual exciting bit, I think, because authentication is kind of like, we get it. Data, there's so many ways to store your data in the cloud. Who's using SQL? A lot of you. Who's using NoSQL? Some of you. So we're using NoSQL for App Center's data storage, and that tends to be, the reality is, it's because basically every single mobile backend as a solution offers NoSQL as their preferred data storage solution. If you look at Firebase, if you look at Pars back in the day, which was built on Mongo, or any of the other MBAS solutions, none of them are really offering SQL as the standard way of storing your data. It's difficult to scale with SQL, as I'm sure most of you know. It's very easy to scale your reads, pretty difficult to scale your writes. So we kind of solved that with Cosmos DB, which is our built from the ground up cloud first database. It's geo-replicated, both read and write, guaranteed SLAs on the performance. So if we don't meet the performance guarantees that we've set you, we will give you some money back. We're that confident in its performance. And this is old technology in terms of Microsoft, but it's new technology in terms of customers. This database has been internal at Microsoft for almost a decade, empowering some of our biggest estates. And as I say, it was built for the cloud, it's built for that multi-read and write, and you can guarantee the performance of it. It's NoSQL, so it's actually a multi-model database. In terms of, as a developer, we can say, I want to use the Gremlin API. Anyone familiar with Gremlin? It's like graph database, which to me is a real relational database because it's nodes and vertex. So vertex and, what is it, vertex and edges. Vertex and edges, it's been a while since I played with that. So you can do table storage, Cassandra, Gremlin, all of these different APIs that are available to you. You've got Mongo APIs as well, so if you're using MongoDB right now, you can just do a Mongo dump and then a Mongo restore, but pointing at Cosmos. And we've got that API compatibility to make sure that all your existing Mongo code, so all of those drivers, will continue to work with Cosmos. The same is true for Cassandra, so if you're using Cassandra and you then want to migrate to Cosmos, we can help you with that. You can tune within the context of what we're building today, the data storage through an SDK. But obviously, because it's using Cosmos DB under the hood, you can use any number of SDKs that are shipped from the community. So you don't have to just use the App Center SDK. But I want to jump a little bit into Cosmos in more detail. So it's going to transparently replicate your data to wherever your users are. This is pretty important for a performant mobile app. I went to help a customer in Ethiopia, a big airline over there. You can probably guess who they are just from that. They built their mobile application. They needed to ship it by Friday. I flew in on the Monday to try and help them. And on day one, I was like, okay, so your app seems a little bit slow. Do you mind if I ask where have you got things hosted right now? And they're like, okay, so our database is on the west coast of the US. I was like, okay, interesting. Where's your compute resource? What's sitting in front of that database? Oh, that's in India. Huh. So think about that for a moment. Every request from their mobile app, starting in Ethiopia, was bouncing up to India and bouncing all the way across the globe over to the west coast of the US to get the data from the database and then coming all the way back and then down to Ethiopia. So it's an incredibly inefficient way to get the data. And so just by moving the database into the same region as their compute resource, we managed to increase the performance. So it's this idea of moving the compute resource and data storage as close to your users as possible is going to make a more performant app. And it's a concept we're all familiar with. We're all using CDNs, right? Content delivery networks? Not all hands are going up. If you're building web, I think most of you should be. Yes? Dubious. It has elastic scalability. So as I say, we will SLA back, so money back, we will guarantee that we meet the scale and demand that you need. If you need to have 1 million read and writes in a second, we can do that. We can meet that demand. We'll just keep scaling. Now, the pricing for this is an interesting one. You pay per request unit, and a request unit is based on the size of the JSON that you're transferring, and then the amount of compute resource and RAM and network infrastructure required to actually fulfill that request. Now, what we have is a pricing calculator that allows you to upload some sample JSON, and then you can say how many users you expect to actually query this data and request it, and it will give you a rough estimate for the costings, so that it's not completely in the dark as to what this is going to cost. And we also have the multiple consistency levels. So we can say that we want this to be like SQL, that when I write to my database, that it won't actually give me that 200, yes, I've actually written that, until it's written to every single location around the globe to make sure that that data is consistent everywhere. Or I can slide that consistency scale all the way to the other end, which is just going to write it to my nearest data center as quickly as possible, and then at some point it will then send those changes out to all of the other regions. It's all done for you behind the scenes. You just select on that scale what consistency level you want, and then when you throw your data into the database, it will then be replicated depending on the selection. And in terms of locations to replicate, we've actually got a huge amount. So this is what we call a Ring 0 product within Azure. So this is being deployed to every single data center that we create. So as we create new data centers, for example, down in South Africa, it will have Cosmos as one of those guaranteed services that get deployed. So any new data centers that you hear about being deployed and being built, it will have Cosmos. And in terms of how do I actually go ahead and support or replicate my data to those locations, all I have to do is tick. I just come in and tick the location, boom, 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 boom. I want it in South Africa, I want it in Australia, I want it in Hong Kong, wherever that is. In the US, I hit save, and that's all I have to do, and it's going to deal with that deployment to create those instances for me. When I'm done with that, I can come in and untick those and hit save again, and those have gone. So I like this because when I'm presenting in other parts of the world, I sent down to Hong Kong to go and present, I can just go and deploy the nearest data center there, and my app seems a little bit faster. So these are the supported protocols. So we have SQL API, so we can use all of our existing SQL knowledge. With Cosmos, we have MongoDB, Cassandra, Gremlin, Table, and this is in preview, which is etcd API. No idea, but it's in preview. I think it's something to do with Kubernetes. Not 100% sure on that. We're using the SQL API. That's a requirement if you're using App Center data. So if you've got an existing Cosmos DB instance that you've already deployed and it's using Mongo, you won't be able to use that with App Center data. But if you're doing a file new, make sure that you select SQL API. Obviously, we're just storing JSON in the cloud, but we're able to query this using a SQL-like API. So that's why we call it SQL, even though it's a NoSQL database. The history of the term NoSQL, I think, is quite an interesting one, and definitely one for the pub rather than here. But if you're not aware of it, I highly recommend looking it up. So the Xamarin SDK, we've got the backend. It's built on this global scale database that's used for millions and millions of customers every day, and we can fulfill billions of requests per second if we need to. How do we actually consume it from our mobile application? Well, we shipped this really nice SDK, and there's some important things to think about with the SDK is that there are two types of data. There's app data and there's user data. So the app data is read-only. You can't write. If you try and write to the app data partition, your SDK will throw an exception. It will say, nope, you can't write there, I'm sorry, that's read-only. If you want to write, then you'll be using the user data. Now that requires, obviously, the user to have signed in first, and it will take that user ID property that we get back in that user information object from the authentication, and it sets that. In fact, you can kind of see that. Well, crikey, that's very small. But you can just about see that on the partition key here. We're partitioning on the user ID. So all of those users' documents are partitioned by the user ID. Perfect. This is an example of a document that I've created. So it's a tracking link. We use these internally at Microsoft to see who's driving traffic to particular content. This is my POCO. So this is from my .NET object. This is what is attached to it from the App Center SDK. So this is worth noting, because if you want to play around with Cosmos without using that SDK and you're adding new items or updating items, you're going to need to make sure that it has these properties as well. Otherwise, it's not going to work. Now, in terms of the SDKs to create a partition, it's just as simple as the Authentication API. It's incredibly easy. Again, we're not animals, so we're using async await. And we call data.createAsync, and then we pass in, in fact, let's make this a bit easier. We pass in the ID, which is a string. We pass in our POCO, which is plain old CLR object. It's just a normal .NET object. So normally I throw these into a folder called models. You might call them entities or data objects, down to you, but they're just plain CLR objects. We pass those in, and then we define that partition. Now, by default, we actually have a static class, which has two partitions defined for you. It's that app and user, and when you select user, it will take the user ID and set that as a partition key for you automatically. You can just pass in a string here if you'd like. So if you want to create your own partitions and partition the data how you want, you also have that option as well. When you do that, it will become read and write. So that's just worth noting that if you're creating your own partitions, it's going to be read and write. If you just want it to be read only, you want to go with that app partition. So with this approach, we call create async, tracking link, blah, blah, blah. Let's imagine I'm not on the internet. We would throw an exception that would get caught in this catch, and then we would use App Center to track that crash. That might not be what I want to happen if I've got no connection to the internet. Perhaps I want the SDK to deal with this more graciously for me. So what we can do is we can actually use these write options as another parameter of this method to specify how long do we want this object to live before we kill it. So in this case, I'm saying infinite. So if I write to using this create async with this infinite, if I'm not connected to the internet, that's just going to sit on the device until the time that I am connected to the internet for infinite amount of time. So the heat death of the universe could occur, and it would still be sat on this mobile device waiting to sync to our data center. Obviously, it wouldn't ever get a connection. Or we could go ahead and set that for 20 days. Now, it's worth noting that those write options, we also have them available for reading data. So we can specify that when we're grabbing data from the database, that we want to hold this on the device indefinitely, or maybe we want to hold it just for a week. By default, we'll cache that data on the device just for 1 day. If you want to override that, you would use these parameters. Let's jump through. So to read a document, it looks super similar. Again, await data.read async. We're passing in our POCO here. In fact, let's make it easier again. We pass in our POCO, our type. Our ID comes in here. Again, just a string. And then the partition of which we want to read this data from. And then we can pass in that cache duration, again, which is going to be infinite here, to say that I want to hold this on the device forever in time. Reading lists is slightly different. Reading lists of data, we don't currently support the ability to cache on the device. It's just a call out, you get a response back, and we're not going to do any caching. I have requested that as a feature. I haven't been promised anything, but hopefully that will be coming so that we can cache all of these responses rather than constantly having to do calls out when we're getting lists. So if we look at the second line here, so we get our response come back. The response has a property of pages, so we can ask for the current page, and then we can deserialize our values. So we're not quite getting back just an IEnumerable of the object that we expect. There's a little bit of work because we're dealing with paging. Right, demo. I'm probably running way over time. Am I?
You're doing fine.
Perfect. So I'll show you the mobile app. This was built using Xamarin. There we go. Not having a physical escape key is very difficult. Who here uses a Mac?
I did until yesterday.
You did until yesterday? What happened yesterday?
I swapped it for a Lenovo thing.
Oh crikey, how are you finding it?
I love it. It's got an escape key.
It's got an escape. Can I borrow it? Cool, so for those of you who didn't put your hands up, I guess you're using PCs? Yeah? With Windows? Anyone using Linux? One. Nice. Microsoft loves Linux. We really do. We've even built it into Windows now. So this is our IDE. This is that Visual Studio for Mac is actually a rebranded Xamarin Studio, which is actually a rebranded Mono Develop, which is actually a rebranded something else that I can't remember. So it's kind of, you can trace its history all the way back to, I think it might be called Sharp Develop or something. It was a fork off from that many, many years ago. But this was one of those products that when Microsoft were looking through the technologies that Xamarin owned, kind of a question mark went next to it. It wasn't a tick, wasn't a cross, and there's a little bit of politics to make sure that this would live on. So what we did is we requested that we rebranded Xamarin Studio to be called Visual Studio, because then it would be much, much harder for an executive to decide to kill, because you couldn't possibly kill Visual Studio. So we rebranded it, but with that came a whole new set of expectations from users, certainly around the quality of the IDE. So the team have been worked extremely hard, poor chaps, to try and make this much more reliable and much less focused on mobile as well. So actually their big focus right now is on ASP.NET and .NET Core tooling, as well as C and C++, which is quite strange, because you'd imagine all the former Xamarin people focus myopically on Xamarin, but they're actually not. So just some updates in this version of Visual Studio. This is the brand new preview that dropped not too long ago, a couple of days. This whole code editor is rebuilt from scratch. So this is actually taking a whole load of code from Visual Studio, I call it Visual Studio Beast. It's because it's a Visual Studio that does everything. It's the PC version, the one that we all know and love. We've taken a huge amount of code to deal with the text rendering, and we've ported that over to the Mac. So obviously this is built entirely with C#, but then we've changed the view here that you're looking at to be a native Coca view. So it's using the native drawing APIs that are available to Mac OS developers to create this user interface. A couple of months ago, this was actually using something called GDK Sharp, which was cross-platform UI framework which came from Linux, because our co-founder, Miguel, created GNOME, if anyone's heard of that. It's quite popular in the Linux world. So it's based off technology like that, but we're replacing it slowly with more native bits, and I think it's looking quite nice. I use it as my daily driver, and I'm quite happy. So it's powered by Roslyn, so the C# compiler service that we know and love from the PC, that runs over here. As I say, we're trying to share as much code as possible between Visual Studio on PC and Visual Studio for Mac. That's just because of the amount of engineering resources that this product has. It makes sense to make sure that we're leveraging the years of coding that's gone into Visual Studio for PC. So I've got my mobile app. It's a Xamarin.Forms application. You all know Xamarin, right? You've all kind of nodded along earlier on. We're all familiar with Xamarin.Forms? Not sure. Too shy to say. There's some shaking of heads. Xamarin.Forms is our abstraction API, so it's kind of a write once, run anywhere technology, but it's not drawing the widgets on the screen like Qt would do, or Google's Flutter, for example. When I ask for a button with Xamarin.Forms, when I'm running on Android, it's going to grab a button from the widgets namespace, and it's going to create me a native Android button. But if I was to inspect the memory of the device, it would be very, very difficult to detect whether or not I was running a Xamarin app or a Java application. The only real giveaway would be that I'd be seeing Mono was running alongside. But in terms of the UI stack, it's absolutely native. Xamarin.Forms just abstracts away the differences between the different platforms. All buttons have clicks. On iOS, they're actually called Touch Up Inside. Very strange name. Yeah, I don't know what they're touching. But these differences are seen across all of the different platforms. And as developers, it's our job to go and learn all of these. But Xamarin.Forms abstracts these away so that you just get one common API that you can use across all of the platforms, and it calls down ultimately to those native APIs. So that's how I've built this application. So in order for that to work, I have what we call the heads, so the front end. And in this case, I have an Android and iOS. I can also target UWP. There you go. I can also target WPF. Anyone doing WPF? I love WPF. It's so nice. So you can target WPF. You can target macOS, so you can build native Mac applications. Has anyone heard of Kaizen? Samsung. Yeah. So Samsung realised that they needed some apps to run on their devices, and that no one was going to build apps for their OS. So they built their development strategy all around Xamarin.Forms. So Xamarin.Forms is the way to build a Kaizen application. Think of that whatever you will. But if you want to build an application for your fridge, Xamarin.Forms is the right technology for you. If you want to build an application for your TV or your watch, you can do that with Xamarin.Forms, targeting Kaizen as well. And obviously with the UWP side of things, you can target HoloLens, Xbox, PCs, some slightly older phones, tablets, but anywhere that UWP will run, Raspberry Pis, some myriad of different devices. And this is all from that one code base using native APIs, building native looking apps. So my front ends don't have an awful lot going on in them. I've got my app delegate, which is my entry point in the iOS world. Hopefully you can see that. I have my did finish launching, and in fact, do I have, this is Xcode. I was working on a little Swift project on the way in. I don't know if this is going to be Swift UI or not. No, it's not. Perfect. No. App delegate, look at that. It's exactly the same. Did finish launching with options. Crikey, that's even smaller. You can see that? Just a function. I don't know what it's trying to run. It's just a function, but what I'm trying to show here is that the APIs for iOS building with Swift or Objective-C are mapped over in the Xamarin world. We use something called p-invoking. Has anyone p-invoked before? Perfect. It's just a way to call down to native APIs. Microsoft invented it for .NET to talk to the Windows APIs, Win32 APIs, which are C-bound. So p-invoking just allows you to communicate from managed to unmanaged. We took that and we run it in Xamarin. And so we have the same methods, because if I go to declaration, what do I want to do? I kind of want to see the code behind for this. I'll have to show you later, I think. But we can go to the code behind and actually see the bindings for this. This is also all on GitHub as well, so you can see there's no magic. So I've got my application, and then the core bit of my app, because this is just the head, is actually written in this .NET Core library. So within this .NET Core library, I've brought in a package which is Xamarin.Forms. So it's all the way down here. Version 4, it's exciting, much better than version 1 point something. Yeah, 1.5. There's been a lot of work on Xamarin.Forms to increase performance, to increase stability, and increase the number of APIs we have. So version 4, I'd say the biggest feature of version 4 has to be the UI collection view. So I can create a UI collection view now, rather than having to fudge tables and try and make my own. It's lovely, because I've got a UI collection view for the app that I'll be showing you today. Maybe I can show you on the iPad. So I'm going to get this running in the simulator so you can see what we're actually building. And whilst that's hopefully building and launching there, let me see if I can. Here we go. One build error. Well, that's exciting. Unexpected character. So the debugger's connecting, and this is using the same simulator that comes with Xcode. So this isn't our simulator. We do actually have a simulator that runs on the PC. It comes from Visual Studio Enterprise. So if you're using Visual Studio Beast, as you may now be using with your new PC, congratulations, sir. You can use Xamarin's remote view of this. So it's effectively a video stream with multi-touch enabled, so we can do things like pull to refresh, zooming in. It's actually slightly more interactive on a PC than it is on a Mac, because if I multi-touch on my screen, I just make smudges. I'm sure you'll be able to actually do something with yours. So this is the application. It doesn't look like it's quite loaded, the first tab, but here's the second tab, which is a list of advocates, and I can scroll down, tap on myself. I see myself, look at that, some little information about me, and then we've got the maps. We can see where I went to with Ignite. And I can also come in and hit sign in. But because I'm already signed in, hopefully it shouldn't ask me, but maybe it's going to. I can sign in again if I want to. That's pretty cool. Hopefully it signed me out then. So this is our application. It's pretty simple, but it's built with Xamarin.Forms, version 4. As I say, I can target these different platforms just by making sure those NuGet packages are all in there. I haven't actually built this for Android yet. That's my weekend task. I actually brought my Pixel so I could get started on it on the train home. So it's just for iOS at the moment. But if we also launch, let's see, let's do like an iPad Pro. I'm going to force quit, he says. Oh, it looks like it may have loaded. So the blog posts have loaded. So the first tab is blog posts from 3 different feeds that we have within Microsoft. So I wanted to be able to get the news for what things my colleagues are publishing, so I connected to the Medium feed that other advocates, cloud advocates publish to, also the Azure blog, but then also the App Center blog as well. So anytime we release a blog post, I want to feed that into my application so that I can get a push notification and know, oh, there's a new blog post, I should go and read that. So it's basically a very basic RSS feeder, and when I tap on an item, it goes through to SS Safari View Controller, and I can read that in all its glory, and obviously being SS Safari View Controller, I can turn on the nice reader mode. A new thing that will be coming in a branch very soon is our immersive reader, which is a new service released at Build, which helps people with dyslexia to read. So it's basically an iframe where we pass in some content and it will render it and allow you to read aloud, and if you tap on words it will show you pictures of what those words are as well. So if you're learning a language or you've got disabilities, then you can add those into your applications to make things a bit more accessible. So I'm actually dyslexic, so that's fairly helpful, because for me reading I need to make sure that the spaces between the lines is just right. If they're too close I can't read it, if they're too far I can't be bothered. So I'm quite fussy on that, which is why I love the reader in iOS. But anyway, we have an AI feature that can do that for you as well now. So how am I getting the data into the blog posts? Well, that's a very good question. Thank you for asking. Let's go back to running that. The answer is with Logic Apps. So I mentioned before that the app data is read-only. The first time I tried to write to the app data and I was like, I've got some blog posts I want to feed into you, and it threw an exception. I was like, oh, so I can't write directly to that. How am I going to get data into there? And so I started creating an Azure function using .NET Core 2 point something, I think it's 2.2, and I realized fairly quickly that .NET Standard didn't have an API for reading RSS feeds like .NET Framework, because they're not 100% compatible. So I was like, okay, well, I'll grab a NuGet package that replaces that functionality. And I was like, nope, that seems to have a bug that isn't quite working how I want it to. And I was debugging C# code for an Azure function to basically throw data into a database. And I was like, this is not what I want to be doing. I wanted to build a mobile app, and I just wanted to get some data into my database, which shouldn't be that difficult. So I went with Azure Logic Apps. Who has used Azure Logic Apps? 2 hands from that man. Very good. Does that mean you've used it twice?
Used it a lot over a year.
Perfect. How do you find it?
Good and bad.
Good and bad.
It's
We'll hear the good.
what, sorry?
We'll hear the good.
It's very capable. There's a million billion building blocks out of the box, and every time I log on there's even more than last time. Incredible to watch it debugging live. So if you've got a 50-step workflow and you've got 50 items in the queue, you can click on any one and watch it make its way down the workflow, watch all the values. If it fails and you were in bed, you can come in the following morning and see which step it failed and how far it got through and all the values.
Yeah.
So cool for all that stuff. Big bitch to deploy.
To deploy?
Yeah, because you birth it in a dev environment.
Yeah.
And then to export it, you have to go to Visual Studio, into the editor, export it as JSON, as an ARM template. It's locked onto a GUI to the instance it was born in.
You're talking about repeatable deployments.
Yeah.
And I'm with you. Are you coming to the panel afterwards? Because I'd love to get some feedback to go back to the team.
I've been playing around with the Azure Logic Apps management API literally this afternoon, trying to see if I can reverse engineer it. I've not quite got there, but I think there is a way of doing a repeatable deployment through the management APIs.
There's definitely ways to do repeatable deployments. Absolutely.
Very carefully what you did the first time.
No. With the ARM templates, I mean, they can be a bit of a dark art when you're getting started with them, but you can fill them with variables. So that
That's
when
what you have to do. But
yeah.
I did it all by hand.
Yeah, I mean that's the only real way to do it.
Repeatable, so
Yeah.
it's infinitely redeployable, but when you make a change, you have to go back and change all the tokens again.
We should chat. So you heard all the good things. So the thing I love about Logic Apps is, number one, it's built on top of a technology called Azure Functions. Are we all familiar with functions? I saw that there was another functions talk here the last time or the time before ago. It's out serverless, there's absolutely servers, cloud, global scale compute resource. So we chuck at it some code it's going to execute, and as a developer we don't care about the underlying compute resource that it's running on, be it a virtual machine or an instance of app service. How much RAM it's got, CPU, is irrelevant. So this being built on top of Azure Functions means that I have global scale. I can guarantee that this will just reach the demand that is required of it. If all of my colleagues decided to post 1 million blog posts, that this should be able to handle that without me as a developer having to worry about that scale, which is a huge win in my opinion. It has those out-of-the-box connections like you mentioned, sir. It's got hundreds, if not thousands, of connections to allow you to integrate. So this is primarily built as an integration service to tie together different services and create kind of business logic. When I first joined Microsoft, I looked at this a little bit negatively because it was mostly my managers that were using it that couldn't write code. So I kind of turned my nose down at it, like, well, it's not code, why would I use that? But it's actually incredibly powerful, and as you mentioned about the debugging, coming in the next morning and something had failed, and you can visually see where did it go wrong, what were the values that were fed into that step that caused it to go wrong, and then you can start to make that a bit more, resilient to those failures. And you can create these complex logic just using drag and drop. So we think about the flow of our data and our business logic in our brains as we're writing our switch statements and our if statements. We just drag and drop with this. So the kind of visual map I build in my brain is really easy to then map out within the designer. So to feed the blog feed, what I'm doing is I'm using a couple of logic apps, and it's not just one. I could have put this in one really big, huge logic app, but I decided to separate things out, and hopefully it will become apparent why. So let's take azure.microsoft.com/blog. We publish a new post to that, and I have my logic app, which is running every 3 minutes, as we know by the little 3. And this has the RSS connector. So I haven't written any code, I've just created a new logic app and I said I want an RSS connector, and here is the feed URL that I want you to listen to. And every 3 minutes, Azure will wake up my logic app and it will check is there a new item on that feed, and if there's not, it skips. So I haven't paid a penny for that to occur, but anytime there is a new item, I need to do some work. So what I do is I take the response that I get and I throw that onto an Azure storage queue. There's a new message. And that Azure storage queue is connected to another Azure Logic app, which deals with new blog posts. Now the reason I've done this is there's actually multiple, as I mentioned there's 3 at the moment, but I can easily add more Logic apps that are feeding into that queue. So as I find new blogs that I think are interesting, I can create a new Logic app, it finds a new post, it throws it into the queue, and it fires off this whole process. And I know that it shouldn't, in theory, break any of the things below it through editing the top. So when that new post comes in, I need to do a few things. So number one, the app itself showed a nice little image. Remember, as we're scrolling through, it had the image and then the text underneath. Well, I need to get that image from the blog, or from the blog post. And that's easier said than done. So what I do is I connect up to cognitive services with the URL preview service. So with the URL preview service, I can get the main image URL, I can get a summary of the contents of the page, and I can also be told if it's not safe for work content. So has it got any not safe, inappropriate content that you wouldn't want to have anybody look at. Or maybe you do, maybe that's what you're filtering with. You can decide. Up to you. So I get that response back as some JSON. I then move on to step 2, which is to save that data to Cosmos DB. And once I've saved it to Cosmos DB, I need to call off for another service, which is to resize those images. Because the image that I'm going to take from the main image URL that comes from this service here, well, that's a full-size image designed for desktop. And I'm actually showing it in a tiny little mobile app. And so I don't need that full version for that tiny little screen. So I'm using the cognitive services image resizing services, which uses artificial intelligence, to do something called smart cropping. So I'm cropping down to a much smaller size, but to do that, I fire off the data onto a new queue. and then that's processed. And then from there, number 4, I move on to a push notification to notify the user. So if we dig into the imagery size queue, this is obviously then connected up to another Logic app, which again, 3 minutes is a default, and I've just left that as such. Every 3 minutes it checks the queue. There's a new item on the queue, it will start to process it. If I add 1 million items to the queue, it won't just be one instance of Logic app that is dealing with that. It will spin out as many instances as it needs to in order to decrease the queue. The reason I'm using queues and not HTTP is that with a queue, we can very quickly decide whether or not we need to create new instances or not. So we watch to see, is a queue shrinking or is it growing? If it's growing, we'll just keep adding more instances until we start to see the queue start to shrink. With HTTP, we have no concept of when the next request is coming in, so we scale out aggressively. Obviously, you only pay for what you use, so if we scaled out to 1,000 instances and it was just one HTTP request, then you'd only pay to fulfill that one request. But it's just an FYI that if you want to make our lives easier, and I think your lives easier as well, to guarantee that it's just going to scale correctly, try and put things into a queue where possible. So we have the queue connected to the Logic app, and again we're using cognitive services with that smart image crop to crop the image. Once we've cropped it, we update the post back into Cosmos, which is connected to the app using the App Center SDK, and then we go ahead and delete that message off the queue so that it doesn't get repurposed. Then onto the notifications. Again, connects to a Logic app, which very simply sends out through App Center Push. So because App Center Push, as I mentioned right at the beginning, every single thing you saw me do, we haven't seen me do yet, but in the portal, is available through a REST API. I've automated that so that I call those REST endpoint, or HTTPS, with my payload, and then that sends out the push notification to the app. And then once that's happened, I can go ahead and delete that message. You wouldn't believe how long it took to build those slides. Just animate like that as well.
I was just about to say, how long was it taking to do those slides?
That was maybe about 2 hours, just for like 8 slides. Yeah. It's because I'm new to PowerPoint. I normally use Keynote, but I figured my colleagues might want a copy of this. And you can't really say to your colleagues, sorry, I used a Mac-only app. So this is the flow. And what I like about Logic Apps is I can just bolt on more, and I'm only paying for the time that it executes. So if there's nothing in the queue, it'll still wake up every 3 minutes, have a look, oh, there's nothing there, don't need to do anything. Additional services to make this run are Azure Blob Storage, so for storing those photos that I've cropped down, updating those links obviously then points to the blob storage. Storage queues, artificial intelligence, and I've got the URL preview and smart image resize, and then coming soon will be the reading part in order to help dyslexics like myself read the content. So I just want to jump straight into the portal actually, because I want to wrap this up. So,
I just add one thing.
of course.
It's pretty easy to add your own services as custom steps into the Logic apps.
Yes. Yeah, so if you want to build connectors or triggers or whatever you want to extend Logic apps, you're absolutely able to do that. The most basic way would be to create an endpoint, so an endpoint through HTTP that you can just go and tickle with some data and get it to wake up. But there are other options available to you as well. The thing I like about the Logic apps is that every single time I launch it, there is a new thing that I can do with Logic apps. And I don't have to learn an API, I'm just learning through clicking. And that's how I learned to use a computer when I was 4. So it feels very, very comfortable to me to just click around until something works. So this is my dashboard for the application. You can see how much it's costing. So at the moment, we're at $239 for this month. I've been most of that is from Cosmos, to be fair. From Cosmos DB in terms of the reads. I'm reading the database quite often. I could definitely get more efficient, especially around that caching on the device. I'm not using any of that on the device. So every time you launch the app right now, it does a full request from the database. So let's have a look at the let's have a look at the new blog post queue because that's the most exciting. I had some failures, so let's have a look at why I had some failures because that's the exciting bit. Waking up in the morning and not seeing a list of push notifications on my phone tells me that something has gone wrong in the cloud. There's no way that no one didn't publish. And so what I come in and I look at is the failed. So I get to see every step of my Logic app, and I can see straight away I've failed on step 2, so that's fairly early doors to be failing. Why don't we have a look at, well, what did we get in? So we had the new post, and then we've got this body here with our message text. And the message text is pretty simple. It's just some JSON with a link to the URL and some other data that I get from the RSS connector. So what's going wrong here? Okay, so this looks to me on first impressions like it might be some malformed JSON. Which is precisely what it is. And I knew that actually because I turned off the thing that was causing it to fault, which is that the blog that I've connected to, which is the App Center development blog, has invalid XML. So the feed that it's generating isn't valid, so no RSS feeder would be able to read it ever. So the connector is still taking a response from that. It knows that something's been updated, but it doesn't know when the end of that new blog post is. So it's throwing a dirty message into my queue, which was then processed. These failures, there's actually 781 of them. So it tried 781 times to process that before I logged in the morning and saw that something had gone wrong. So obviously what I need to do is dequeue that poisoned message and not put it back on the queue to then be reprocessed. I need to put it into a naughty corner, which is a step for the weekend, I think. But let's have a look at something that did work. That did work. No, it will work, trust me. Let's there we go. So we get our response come in, we pass some JSON, pretty basic stuff. From that, we start to set some variables to reuse later on in the script. We do a HTTP request, which is off the URL preview service. I pass in my query here, which just happens to be the URL that I get from that original message that comes through. I get my response come back, which is family friendly. I have the original URL, a description, which is just a summary of the text that's available to me, and then this primary image, which is the thing that I was most interested in. So that's what I get back, which is obviously I'm going to want to crop down. We pass some more JSON. We create an ID, so a new GUID for this object. So it's going to be a new item in my database. I query my database for the URL of the blog post to make sure that I don't already have that same blog post in my database. If that comes back with no items, so you can see I'm doing a select from where, so fairly generic SQL stuff if you've used SQL. If I get no response or 0 count, then we, in fact it's in here, if there's 0 items, then we go ahead and save into Cosmos. And then once we've saved, we actually just go ahead in this version and push straight to the mobile device. So this ran when? Let's have a look. Huh, fairly recently. Did I get a notification? Oh, I got notifications. So let's have a just to be clear, I am using Edge on a Mac. Bound to be issues. So the message came in here, which was blog.blockchain workbench. Let's see. Here we go. Can you just confirm that I have a push notification, second one down, that is about blockchain workbench?
Integration with Azure.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So every single time every single time that there's a new blog post, this Logic app is triggered for me. It tickles App Center to go off and send a push notification to all registered users that speak English, because I know that the posts are all written in English, so there's no point in sending it to Chinese users. It's super, super easy to get started with this stuff. It's just drag and drop. And when it doesn't work, which it doesn't all the time, you get the details of exactly what went wrong. And I really like that, because when stuff goes wrong with my code, all I get is a stack trace to go and dig through in some random portal. To just be able to come into the actual designer of where I've got this logic and debug is super, super nice.
And what if I don't like UI? What if I want to automate my deployments?
You can script this. So actually, I'm using the UI because I don't want to write code for this. But if I wanted to, and it's worth noting that's a really good question. I'm so glad you asked that. When we come to the Logic App Designer, which is here on the left, we get to design, which is lovely. And I can come in, I can add a new step. I definitely don't want to add a new step, but we could do Cosmos DB again. We could create a stored procedure, for example. But we don't like dragging and dropping. It doesn't feel like real work. So we can come in and we can click on this code view. Now, you can actually host, I can't remember if it's 6 or 8, but you can host multiple Logic apps within one Logic app. So it's actually multiple triggers within the same Logic app if you code it. If you use the designer, you can only have one set of logic per Logic app. So that's what I've done. I've got those multiple Logic apps because I'm using designer. I could roll those with the code that's generated into just one Logic app, but I wouldn't have that nice designer to show you, and I'd just be sat here showing you this instead, which doesn't look quite as nice, I think. So if you wanted to, you could go ahead and code your Logic app with this approach. If you just want to write .NET,
So
use
is
Azure
that like
Functions.
a parameter in an ARM template and I deploy it that way? Is that
You can deploy it through ARM, absolutely. Yeah, everything with Azure can be deployed using ARM templates. It's how we manage all of our resources within Azure.
And there's some properties that aren't available in Designer as well as multiple triggers. Things like the initial queue size and the queue concurrency. You can play with those.
See, now I'm learning. This is amazing.
Yeah.
Perfect. So some takeaways. It's kind of been a rambling talk, so apologies. I've been getting quite excited at places. App Center it's evolved. It's no longer just a DevOps solution. We now have it as a fully fledged MBAS, so Mobile Backend as a solution. MBAS, Mobile Backend as a Service, is what that stands for. One of the most popular back in the day was called PARS. I used to use that a lot. Facebook bought it and shut it down, unfortunately. But they did make it open source, so if you like PARS, you can host it in Azure. We've got some templates available to you. The question, I think, when it comes to picking an MBAS is about migration. Because MBAS is all about building an app super quickly. I don't want to focus too much on the back end. I just want to get something out the door and see if it sticks. If it doesn't stick, people aren't using it, then I'm not going to invest any more time in it. And I don't want to have built a beautiful back end in C# that's going to scale to meet a demand that's never going to arrive. I've looked at the other competitors, and I've looked at this market extensively, and I think that they fall into a trap of what we call vendor lock-in. They're very sticky services. If you add Google Firebase, for example, to your Swift iOS app, good luck migrating from that, is what I would say. It kind of ties you into their SDK, their way of thinking. You don't get much flexibility about how you design your mobile app, and then also once you don't want to use their database, once you don't want to use Firebase anymore, how do you migrate off that? With App Center using just standard technologies within Azure, there is a very, very clear and easy migration path. Once you find that App Center no longer meets your requirements because you've scaled to such a size that bolting on auxiliary Logic apps to add some extra functionality isn't quite cutting it, you've still got that global scale database that can connect to any amount of services using a myriad of different SDKs. Authentication, as I say, is powered by Active Directory, so it's that same thing. There's a clear migration path. You're not getting locked into a very limited subset of features that have been designed by an engineer for just mobile. These are services that are designed to power all types of different applications. And in this case, we just give you a nice set of mobile SDKs. We use Cosmos and the SQL API. You can easily integrate with all of the other Azure services, and it's going to auto-scale so that if you get really lucky and you manage to build the next Flappy Birds and you're rolling in cash, you don't have to worry about the scale of your backend. You can go and sit on a beach and drink cocktails and know that that backend is just going to scale to meet the new demand. All of the code, the slides in PowerPoint form and PDFs, links to blog posts written about this application, how I've built it, as well as links to some of the services are available at this link, which is acrms/AppCenterTalk, and you'll be able to get access to everything. Any questions?
So I've got a few questions, but just this one is, so around Active Directory BC that you showed, I've had a really rubbish time at the moment trying to get my Azure BC into my native apps. Now, how does that work? Do you have to create a new user flow, can you use the existing flows that you've got? And around the library that you're using, because I'm using the MSAL library, but I'm using like Ionic at the moment to library approach. There isn't a MSAL library that's compatible with Ionic at the moment. Could I still use it, or do you still have to use it on top of that library?
So right now, Authentication and Data, I should say, only support Xamarin, Swift and Objective-C, and Java.
Okay.
So there's no of these web technologies available to you. So you would still have to go down the current pain path you're in. But I do believe the plan is to make sure that we have those support. As you saw, the build, distribution, test has support for React Native, Ionic, and basically if it runs on mobile, we support it. I believe that is the general strategy for the product as a whole. Any other questions?
Quick question. Can you just use the mobile devices just for testing web apps rather than mobile apps?
I think that's a question we get asked all the time. The answer is no, because you can't launch somebody else's app. So unless you're building a browser, if you want to test your browser that you've written, amazing, we can do that. What we're not able to do is launch Safari, for example, unless you were to launch it as an SF Safari view controller from within your application. Because what we're doing is part of for Android it's slightly different to iOS. On Android we launch a second activity that runs in the background, and we communicate to that via HTTP, and that then communicates using accessibility APIs to your app. So it does all the scrolling and the pinching and zooming. iOS doesn't allow you to run two apps at the same time. So what we have to do is we have to embed the SDK within your application. So what you end up doing is creating a build specifically just for doing the UI testing. Now obviously we can't embed a UI testing SDK into Chrome or Safari or Firefox. So we don't support web browser testing. But if you wanted to do it, I've not seen anyone do this, but if you wanted to, you could create a full frame web view. Absolutely, there will be better tools. It's not impossible, but it's not sane. Any other questions? Perfect. Thank you.